Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm here today with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. And today we have an exciting episode because we had one of our viewers actually write us and ask us essentially how to deal with a volatile situation in their family when it comes to narcissistic people and such. And what came out of that was especially wanting to know what was the best approach to use. Would it be better to use silence or to speak up in some situations? And that is a very complex question. So we tried to simplify it for tonight for today's episode. So I really am happy to be able to do this today. So we'll hopefully be able to answer this viewer's question, which is something perhaps a lot more of our viewers also have on their minds. So thank you so much for being here, Fern.
Great to be with you as always. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a GPS that told us whether to speak up or keep silent? Unfortunately, that device does not exist. I certainly could have used that device during the year when I was trying to rebuild my relationship with my brother after decades of estrangement. I would say almost every week I had some exchange with him that forced me to ask myself that question. Should I say something or should I keep quiet? Will this provoke him and make things worse? Or am I going to be uncomfortable having to live with myself as I keep quiet? So it's a really interesting question. And as we dive into it, I think the viewers will see that it really comes down to context. There's no hard and fast rule that you should speak up or you should stay silent.
That is so true, Fern. I think that that's especially a poignant idea that you're bringing, because I think that a lot of times people want to have a recipe book of some sort, and it's if it was that simple, we probably have that book already,
There are just no hard and fast rules. And I think, like you said, a recipe would be great. And here's the other part that's so tricky is you have to be thinking on your feet.
Yep, that is so true, right? And you have to be really quick and adept in some ways to be able to understand, according to the context, what is best to do. So I think that leads us into this. I think this is a good segue into perhaps if we start with silence to begin with, And I think that silence has its place definitely when it comes to conversations or to different interactions with people, and silence is the act of non-communication, right? And it's always good to practice this type of approach when it comes to, ridiculous, superfluous, or volatile type of situations where they just don't deserve an answer. And when you start to use silence in this way, then what you're doing is you're allowing for attention to be diverted away from you as well, right?
Right. Do you want to dignify some ridiculous comment with an answer?
Exactly, right. And that's the thing too. And it's interesting because the German mystic Meister Eckhart, he would actually do this. He would respond only to certain questions that were basically serious and deep. He would meet people with silence when it came to superficial or meaningless questions that didn't deserve an answer. So that was actually making use of silence in a very constructive way, right?
I think too that silence can be very effective as a de-escalation tool. In other words, if you respond, are you actually going to engage in a more difficult conversation?
Yeah, exactly. And that's always good to think a few steps ahead, with regards to that. Is it worth it to push in some ways, or is it good for us to simply hold back so that way we're not adding fuel to the fire? And that's the thing too. That's what silence does, is it buys the peace in a potentially volatile family situation, right? And the thing is that when you choose to hold back, then what happens is that you're conscious of the fact that anything you say or do can boomerang right back to you in that way, and that's really important to recognize that.
Right. And the flip side of this, though, is if you're always silent, who are you?
Yeah, And that's true too, right? And that's, I think that's really, really important to recognize that because in particular, there's always a negative expression of silence, right? If you tend to internalize that, right, and you make that somehow you turn that towards yourself, then that creates its own share of problems, right? And that's the thing that's really, really important to be careful of because there's always going to be, of course, a trade-off if you choose to turn an emotion or a discomfort towards yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that that's really important because I think that because this is so contextual, it's really, really important to recognize that when you're living with a narcissistic family member, a sibling and such, it's different than when you're just visiting family and you can just leave if it gets too awful, right? So that's the thing that's really different. And I would say in some ways that a lot of times people that are living in a situation have to do more damage control, right? And I think also in some ways there can be a little bit more catering, if you will, because you're trying to buy the peace, at least because you're still in the same living environment, So
Right.
oftentimes I suggest to people talk about the other person's interests in that way. It might not feel necessarily intuitive to do that, but if you're thinking buying the peace in the back of your mind, that can actually be a way to help yourself in a particular situation when you're also using silence in key moments, right?
The constant exposure of living with somebody who is somewhat toxic um, is really challenging. You have no place to go. And the dynamic is completely different from when you're living apart.
Yeah, that's the thing that happens. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind. If you're a teenager, for example, you're growing up and you're still finding your place in the world. You haven't moved out quite yet, But once you do make that move and you start to live an independent life, it becomes much easier to contain people that are like that in your life once you have your own space. So that's
Right.
that's really something to consider, of course.
Which is all part of individuating.
Hmm. Yeah. Exactly. So that's really something to be mindful of. And it's people have fragile egos, so that's the thing that happens with narcissistic siblings and such, right? They really become very fragile, and they can often fall into situations where they get emotionally overwhelmed and heated. If you start to engage them too much about the particular contentious issues that they arise with. So coming back to silence, sometimes silence is better simply for that reason, that it won't, as you said, escalate the situation, right?
Right. I think in each one of these exchanges, as I said in the beginning, you have to assess whether how your words will be received. You're probably not going to make all that much headway with a narcissist. So it may be best to simply accept that and detach and disengage. Past behavior is fairly predictive of how it will be received now. So if you've played this tune before and you saw how it came out and it has not been successful, it's probably best to try something else. And that may be not to say anything.
Exactly. So there's various approaches that we can have when it comes to that. And I think that if there's a parent, for example, that enables a volatile sibling to continue in their ways, that sometimes silence is better with regards to that. So because if you do, of course, talk with somebody that you think will help to make a difference, it might in some ways if they see the situation for what it is. But if they don't, for example, and I'm thinking here, a teenager that may be living at home or something, or a young adult living at home, then there can be situations like this where you may need to, of course, remain silent for your own well-being and at least buying the peace temporarily. So that's really important, right?
Right. But I keep coming back to the same point, which is if you're always silent, then you lose yourself.
Exactly. And that's why it's important, of course, to speak up. And just before we move on to this speaking up, there's one more thing I want to say that's really important is that if you have your dreams and your ideals and your aspirations, and you don't feel safe in sharing that, then it's really important to use silence in cases like that. Don't open up to people that might be cynical or toxic or critical towards your dreams. That's really, really important that people understand that. This is a great example of how we can protect ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. You do not want to give somebody you can't trust too much power.
exactly. So moving on now to speaking up. I think that that's the next question that's really, really important for us and for our viewers. And the act of speaking up implies, of course, finding one's voice to be able to defend, denounce, and assert oneself in various scenarios, right? And in light of a statement by another that is positive, negative, or neutral. So, I mean, in some ways, we do want to speak up when we do, of course, want to highlight ourselves, especially in situations where it's important that we do find our voice. Because oftentimes we can get lost in ourselves if we remain too silent for too long, right?
Right. And there are certain tactics which make um, those comments go down a little easier. And I think it's important to be mindful of what works.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so it's important to, of course, speak up. I think when a sibling becomes unreasonable, demeaning, or antagonizing towards us, and it's really important for us to assert ourselves when something inappropriate has been said or directed onto us. You know, and I often find that sometimes even the golden rule can help to elicit a reflective thought in some ways. You know, like you wouldn't like it if I did this to you, for example, so why would you do it to me? That even that statement is a more a safer way of confronting someone rather than saying, why did you do that, you know? So
Or that old trick of when you say things like that, I feel the I messages.
yeah, exactly. So that's another way of course having a non-violent communication with someone, of course, when you're able to do that and more emotion focused, you know. So it's important to speak up, of course, because we want to, of course, correct some misconceptions about us in terms of who we are, what we said, and what we did. And it's really important that, of course, that we recognize that some people can attempt to gaslight us. And it's when we speak up, we give an alternative to people that try to do that. And it's important also to recognize that people can't really speak up on our behalf when it comes to the intent that we have or our emotions, because they're not us, quite simply. So that's important to be able to step up and to be able to speak our truth, especially, right?
As much as they might like to tell you how to feel, they don't get to. You get to tell them how you feel.
Yeah, exactly, right? And of course, if a communication becomes too volatile, I always say to people, you know, do it indirectly, right? Try text or email if there's something that needs to be said more extensively in some ways, and you know that it's just going to degenerate. That's a way to kind of make sure that you're protecting yourself from accusatory and defensive tirades and such, right? So
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with you about texts and emails. I think I try to keep all of my statements on text and email very superficial because I worry that somebody's going to have that and it could really start a nasty exchange where you can't really even read tone because it's not there. It's not in front of you.
you're absolutely right. And I think that the question of how it can degenerate is also a factor as to whether to use silence or speaking up. And that's really, really important. And that's why it's not always clear cut, right? It's always according to context. If it doesn't degenerate, it might actually help to at least push the conversation further. If it does degenerate, then you know to stop, you know not to bite the hook, and you know not to continue because you're going to get more of the same. So it really depends on the person's degree of narcissism, of course, when it comes to that,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, narcissists will send you, 5, 10 paragraphs telling you everything you did wrong, and you have no opportunity to respond.
and that's a great example. If it becomes like a tirade of that magnitude, then you have to simply stop, and it's not helpful. So that means silence is the best approach in that case. If there's leeway, if there's an opening, then great, you know. So I think that in general, what we're talking about here is also just the notion of making room for our personality. I think that that's really, really important because that's really what this is all about. You know, it is about making
Mhm.
room for ourselves to be able to, of course, allow for ourselves to be ourselves in an authentic way, you know, and There's always a danger, I think, when it comes to speaking too much, because if you end up jumping at every single thing that's being said, you become very reactionary and very combative. And it's kind of like the image of a reef, right? You've got some reefs that are really flexible in the wind, right? They can go in some ways and they can bend, and those are the reefs that actually, have a longer lifespan. It's the reefs that are too rigid that eventually with the wind end up breaking. So important for us to realize that it's not good to speak up all the time for every single issue that gets brought up, right?
Well, and I think it's important too to note that this is not like other relationships. This is a sibling relationship with all of the history and baggage that comes with it. And there's a tendency sometimes to regress and to remember childhood hurts and perceptions. And it's difficult to stay in the now. And that is your challenge. How can I relate to my sibling who is attacking me without feeling like the 10-year-old who was ready to throw him across the room?
Exactly. That's a really, really good point you're making. What is the emotion that gets caught up whenever there's a conflict or something that starts to happen over time, right? So I think that's a great question, and we'll have to leave that one perhaps for another episode, because I'm just mindful of the
Yeah.
time, and we're going to need to wrap it up for today. So let's talk about resources, Fern. What is the number one resource that you think you would like to share with regards to our viewers?
Well, since I've been talking about my own estrangement and rebuilding of that relationship with my only brother, I would encourage readers and viewers to consider Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement, and the Road to Reconciliation, which is a book that is not about reconciliation only. There have been a lot of comments that people are refusing to read the book because it has reconciliation in the title. But I also address those who choose not to reconcile.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point you're making because the book is very powerful for that very reason. And I've always told people that the book is about what a healthy reconciliation could look like if it does happen, right? But it is about sibling estrangement since you've lived it for several decades, and it's a powerful book. I do recommend it wholeheartedly to our community and to all our viewers. It's something that is a rich resource in the field of sibling estrangement. And my number one resource would be the workshops that I offer regarding improving self-esteem following my sibling estrangement. The next one I'm going to be doing is going to be sometime in September of this year, 2023. And I think it's going to be a really powerful experience for some of our viewers, should they choose to participate, because it's going to be about showing you experiential exercises that will actually help to foster and make you stronger and to work with, of course, some of the natural strengths that we have as individuals to be able to soothe ourselves and to become more empowered with ourselves. So we can certainly work on countering the inner critic. And I so look forward to doing these workshops because they're more intensive and I get a chance to go much deeper with some of the viewers and participants that I've had before. So I am looking forward very much to doing this. This is going to be a small group of 4 to 5 people. So if anybody feels the need to be on board with me on this, absolutely just contact me and I will include you in the list for this coming fall. So thank you so much for being here, Fern. I really appreciate you and being able to talk about this and go further into some of these questions and some of these topics that mean so much to us. It's not an easy road to follow, and there's not a guidebook to this, but thankfully we are able, of course, to draw a path and help our viewers to empower themselves much more.
Well, we never run out of things to talk about.
That's for sure.
So sibling estrangement has a lot of long tentacles.
Thanks again for doing this, Fern. I look forward to our next episode.
Me too. I know.
Take care. Bye-bye.